in this meeting with you. All right. So the floor is yours, the group of Miss Nicole Hannah. And again, we'll be timing you with 15 minutes. And good luck and congratulations in advance. Take it away.
Hannah Marfa, and together with my colleagues, Salle and Julianne, we will present our paper entitled Countering Food Insecurity Through the Paris Agreement, the Case of the Philippines. A growing number of academics recognize the critical juncture at which countries must put themselves on the path to sustainable development and realize their vision of a green economy by developing and implementing environmental protection policies. According to a recent World Bank report, climate change could push with agriculture as the primary driver, and the majority of the impacts could be mitigated through rapid, inclusive, and climate-informed growth. So to put things in context, the fundamental flaws in design failures of past United Nations climate agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Accord, led to the establishment of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement presented a more feasible plan of action and a more attainable goal through the intended nationally determined contributions, or the INDCs, which are the agreement's unique component that makes it more functional. The INDCs, according to Rajamani, refer to contributions rather than the more formal commitments used in international treaties. Lastly, we identified a gap in the existing literature on climate change initiatives in the agriculture sector and food security in the Philippines. This could be attributed to the Paris Agreement's recent incorporation into national climate policies, as well as the fact that agriculture and food security have received less attention in the Philippine context. Hence, our group has decided to pursue the study for these reasons. So for our research questions, our study heavily relies on the objectives of the Paris Agreement, which highlights adaptation as a response to climate change for developing countries rather than mitigation. So taking this into account, the study aims to address the question of how does the Paris Agreement help developing countries, particularly the Philippines, improve the agricultural sector's adaptive capacities to counter food insecurity? To extensively discuss this problem, the study delves deeper into the objective by investigating first, how can the Philippines come up with a revised national climate change action plan in respect to the Paris Agreement to improve the production and productivity of the agricultural sector? Next, how can the Philippine national government contribute to the capacity building of local Agarion communities with regards to the resilience to natural disasters? And lastly, how can the comparative analysis of other countries' national climate change action plan be used to develop the national climate change action plans of the Philippines? So our group believes that developing countries can address food security by improving climate and natural disaster adaptation plans at the local and national levels in accordance with the Paris Agreement's guidelines and foundations. This study focuses on the Philippines situation since, according to FAO and UNDP assessments, the Philippines lacks a detailed approach and policy implementation in the country's National Adaptation Plan for Agriculture, which is incorporated into the country's NCCAP. We also structured our corollary questions in view of the agreement's statement on food security in paragraph 10 of the preamble, which states recognizing the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger and the particular vulnerabilities of food production systems to the adverse impacts of climate change.
Moving forward to our theoretical and conceptual framework, the analysis of the study centers around the international norm theory, which adopts the idea of international norms and assumes that state identities and interests are socially constructed to some extent. As a result, not only material but also ideational factors affect their behavior. In this case, a shared understanding of a problem across borders. This study employs Finnemore and Sikink's norm life cycle framework to examine international norms that contribute to a common understanding of climate change, in which norms become dominant through a three-stage process, which are the norm emergence, norm cascade, and norm internalization. This framework offers a useful and insightful method for assessing the status and impact of an international norm, and will serve as the foundation for the analytical approach used to analyze how the norm of climate justice has evolved and the direction in which the global conception of climate change is progressing. The norm life cycle model is used to examine the presence of the norm in the language and framings adopted by states and civil society organizations, as well as in the text of the Paris Agreement, which has been ratified by 184 of the 197 parties to the convention. The study concludes that in the context of the Philippines, the norm of climate justice, which is used in the agreement, has not completed its life cycle because the process stops at the norm cascade. The process has been stalled at this stage because a large number of local government units have not prioritized agriculture sector adaptation to climate change in its policies and budget allocation, and in other situations, constituents do not show considerable support for such local government initiatives.
So in chapter 2, we learn more about food production, productivity, and climate change in the Philippines. In this data chapter, we wanted to know how the Philippines could revise its national climate change action plan in light of the Paris Agreement in order to boost agricultural production and productivity. So to answer this, we discussed the current state of the country's agricultural sector, the impact of climate change on food production and productivity, the assessment of existing climate change adaptation and disaster risk resilient measures, and finally, the development of the climate justice norm in the Philippines. Having said that, in order to improve the NCCAP in respect to the Paris Agreement, the country must first ensure that the provisions of the agreement are met, as they have established prerequisites for maintaining food security. In order to do so, the agricultural sector must remain productive in order to develop long-term food production and feed the population. As a result, in order to maintain production, the agricultural industry must be able to adapt to the effects of climate change, and each signatory country's NDCs must include measures to do so. So to contextualize, in the Philippines, the NDCs are declared as commitments under the agreement or incorporated into the country's NCCAP under the Climate Change Act, which is part of national law. So through the monitoring and policy-making framework established in the agreement, the country's compliance with the agreement has facilitated strengthening its agricultural sector's climate resilience, and such improvements would increase food production and productivity.
In the third chapter, we discuss about capacity building and climate resilient agriculture. With this, we aim to answer how can the Philippine national government contribute to the capacity building of local agrarian communities with regards to their resilience to natural disasters. Hence, this data chapter will explore and discuss areas to possibly begin with strengthening the local agrarian communities through capacity building, such as knowledge management transfer, climate smart and climate risk resilient agriculture, sustainable and equitable agricultural development, and local government intervention. With that, we found in this chapter that, in response to the question presented on how can the Philippine national government contribute to the capacity building of local agrarian communities, the first thing to consider is the developmental needs and current capacity of agrarian communities so as to ensure that knowledge management and technology transfer facilitated by these programs are effective. Moreover, the importance of local government units is emphasized in the institutionalization and promotion of the norm of climate justice at the local level, as well as in the implementation and communication of programs or the LCCAP to their respective communities. This must be remedied, especially since knowledge and awareness may stimulate producers and other stakeholders to take necessary actions and slowly enable a shift in their motivations for pursuing such a norm. The difficulties of building capacity were attributed to the shifting political will, the lack of human and financial resources, and the limited availability and accessibility of such programs.
On the last chapter, we explored more about developing the National Climate Change Action Plan. With this, we aim to answer how can the comparative analysis of other countries' national climate change action plans be used to develop the national climate change action plans of the Philippines. Some areas discussed in this chapter are the countries comparable to the Philippines, which are Thailand and Vietnam, and the approaches to climate change of both Thailand and Vietnam. With that, in conclusion, we found out in this chapter that what can be derived from the analysis of similarities and differences between the different developing countries, particularly Vietnam and Thailand, in terms of the implementation and outcomes from their respective national climate change action plans, boils down to the political climate of the country and in incorporating and suited agricultural programs and policies. For most developing countries, particularly in Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, the laws, policies, and programs fairly remain sufficient for now. However, deficiencies in their climate strategy remain very visible as it lacks updates from signed national and international agreements, continuation plans, and strategies as local and national administration change, as well as its poor implementation and monitoring mechanisms.
So the researchers sought to provide a strong foundation on how the Paris Climate Agreement can help developing countries, particularly the Philippines, to improve the agricultural sector's adaptive capacities to counter food insecurity. As such, the following conclusions and recommendations were developed. For the area of food production and quality, we recommend the establishment of seed or gene banks. So NGOs are active in distributing genetically engineered seeds, particularly rice varieties, among farmer organizations to assist them in building adaptive capacities. But to achieve this at the national level, the government itself should establish seed or gene banks throughout the country that is easily accessible to grassroots farmers. They must engage in intensive scientific and site-specific research to ensure that the genetic rice varieties developed would produce high quality and high value crops, climate resilient, and suitable to the local environment. Especially during planting season, these varieties must be distributed in a timely manner, and farmers should be able to easily access and avail these seeds by maintaining stable supply and affordable price rates.
For the aspect of food accessibility, our first recommendation is to reduce the cost of agricultural inputs. So to give context, currently a kilo of rice costs 11 pesos to produce in the Philippines. Meanwhile, in Thailand, there is a 93% difference in the production cost of a kilo of rice. So lowering the cost of agricultural inputs decreases the impact of price shocks on farmers' production and livelihood. Farmers incur enormous risks as a result of uncontrolled elements changes, which is why decreasing input costs would offset the loss in farmers' productivity and livelihood caused by such volatile situations. Lastly, um, our last recommendation for food accessibility is to develop farm-to-road networks. So this is a pervasive issue in the Philippines. Most farmers are more inclined to let their harvest rot rather than spend a fortune on transportation, which significantly impacts these farmers' livelihoods and customers' access to rice. This necessitates road development and vehicle donations to rural areas with funds set aside for such purposes to be administered by local governments. The information for these must be made available and accessible to anybody, particularly people of the affected areas, so that citizen groups can exercise vigilance and ensure that such funds are not misappropriated. For infrastructure and technology, our first recommendation is to establish and invest in financially sustainable irrigation systems. The lack of access to irrigation systems by most farming communities is another pervasive issue in the country's agricultural sector. The problem is that public funds have been channeled into risky initiatives with high construction costs and unpredictable outcomes. So the existing plans for investing in a solar-powered irrigation system are expensive and time-consuming to implement. It would take years for these facilities to be built before a good number of farming communities would have access to them. So additionally, we must consider the reality that maintaining this type of infrastructure is too costly for agricultural communities and the country as a whole. Our next recommendation is to increase accessibility to basic facilities. So this is also in connection with the first recommendation. Most local agricultural communities lack access to crucial equipment and facilities for rice production, including land, irrigation, farm-to-market roads, and drying facilities. The government must ensure that farmers have access to essential utilities in order to produce crops through partnerships and collaborations with the private sector for funding and the CSOs for the distribution and monitoring of amenities. Lastly, we must reduce emphasis on industrialization. So the current DA administration's principal objective is to establish a climate-smart agriculture. So the use of CSA necessitates a shift toward digitalization and technology. In theory, this is a good thing, and international organizations encourage the world's agricultural industries to transition to CSA. However, we must keep in mind that the majority of farmers in the Philippines live in poverty or in remote areas where electricity and network services are very limited. Over 80% of farmers in the Philippines are small scale, which immediately poses an issue for the affordability of CSA equipment. So establishing CSA in the Philippines would only benefit agribusinesses since they have the means and conditions to attain such advanced technologies. CSA would be a viable option if small-scale farmers were in a better economic situation, especially given that they account for the majority of the agricultural industry here in the Philippines.
As for knowledge management transfer, first we have the integration of the agreement in capacity building workshops. So in order to aid norm internalization, domestic actors such as LGUs and NGOs themselves should be equipped to promote the norm of climate justice in the domestic policy discourse, which would then allow them to facilitate the effective transfer of knowledge and information as they implement existing programs. Following this, government agencies such as the CCC and the DA and CSOs must integrate the agreement into their workshops and training to farmers and the youth in order for the public to have foundational awareness and knowledge of the International Climate Agreement, as well as further understand the need to integrate and promote its norms in the sector. This will enable actors to gradually shift their motivations in the long run from purely being externally driven, but also internally driven as a result of norm internalization. Second, we have the mobilization of human resources to facilitate workshops and training. As discussed beforehand, programs facilitating knowledge management transfer are limited in coverage, implementation, and sustainability. Climate field schools, in particular, have shown to produce positive results in some of its pilot locations, which makes it necessary to address these aforementioned issues for these activities to gain traction. For instance, agricultural producers, especially from pilot sites of climate field schools, may be certified through exams and evaluations so that once they are assessed to be capable of leading and training other producers, they may be mobilized to help provide support to LGUs and farmer organizations within and beyond their locality. Not limited to CFS, these may be applied to other programs and other activities where knowledge transfer occurs as well. This may not only address the difficulty of widening the skill of implementation and sustainability, but it also produces employment opportunities for agricultural producers and contributes to their empowerment as a community and sector.
Lastly, for the aspect of the livelihood for small farmers, our first recommendation is to use index-based crop insurance. Under traditional indemnity insurance, which is used now in the Philippines, payouts are based on a client's loss. With index-based insurance, payouts occur when an
Mel and
index
Stella
falls
were going
below
to try
a
lucky
predetermined
bottles.
threshold. Here, there is no field loss adjustment because the policy is solely based on climate data. This should, in principle, result in fast insurance payouts, allowing farmers to reinvest the earnings in planting the following year's crop. Second is the readjustment of requirements in claiming benefits and strengthening programs for small farms. In respect with Republic Act 7607, which is the Magna Carta of small farmers, succeeding policies and requirements under programs must be truly aligned with the law. The economic feasibility of the principal activities performed, the cooperative leadership and management capability, and the absence of democratic oversight by the members are all inherent shortcomings of cooperatives. The government must also look into who run cooperatives as their goal is to help small farmers. However, big farmers harvesting more than 10 hectares are included in most cooperatives, which clearly does not give enough attention to small farmers who need the granted machineries, for instance, the most. The government's improper intervention and control has been a big contributor to this. This reliance and inadequate economic foundation have contributed to a low degree of desire for small-scale farmers to join cooperatives and participate in them, as well as a low-quality procedure for electing cooperative leaders. To add to this, agencies such as the NFA shall also adjust their eligibility criteria in buying harvests from farmers. Issues under this include the following. First, NFA offices are not accessible to small farmers as they do not have the necessary resources, such as trucks, to bring in their harvest. Bringing the farmer's harvest to NFA does not guarantee a high buying price point, as NFA has criteria such as moisture contents to pass through the screening and buy the harvest at a higher price. NFA, despite its promoted high buying price, takes 1 to 3 months to release payments to farmers as it needs to undergo financial procedures on their end, which is clearly disadvantageous to farmers as they wait for a long period of time for their income to be handed over. The sad reality is that farming, indeed, especially farming rice in the Philippines, has not been a profitable venture, especially to our small farmers. Most farmers settle to selling their harvest at a low price because most, if not all of them, cannot afford to wait for long payouts and or cannot afford to rent trucks and bring their harvest to drying and milling stations to qualify for the eligibilities set by government agencies.
To conclude, the Paris Agreement is a turning point in the multilateral climate change process because, for the first time, a legally binding agreement brings all nations together in a common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and adapt to its effects, requiring economic and social transformation based on the best available science. This paper focuses on, as lifted from the Paris Agreement's preamble, in recognizing the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger and the particular vulnerabilities of food production systems to the adverse impacts of climate change, in consideration with the national strategic priority on food security of the Philippines to ensure availability, stability, accessibility, and affordability of safe and healthy food amidst climate change. With this, the researchers seek to provide a strong foundation on how the Paris climate can help developing countries, particularly the Philippines, to improve the agricultural sector's adaptive capacities to counter food insecurity. And that is all for our presentation, Countering Food Insecurity through the Paris Climate Agreement, the case of the Philippines. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much to the group of Nicole, Ozara, and Julianne. Okay, so moving forward now, may we call on the next presenter. May we call on Mr. Bryan Loterinia from the University of the Philippines-Diliman. He'll be presenting his paper on the green in Philippine IR, the state of Philippine environmental foreign policy in the 21st century. Okay, Bryan, the floor is yours.
And my paper presentation entitled The Green in Philippine IR, the State of the Philippine Environmental Foreign Policy in the 21st Century. So basically, this paper tries to answer the questions how the Philippines, as developing and vulnerable country to climate change and weather events, performs and behave in its environmental foreign policy in the 21st century, given the fact that there's also a minimal study and literature that discuss the context of Philippine environmental foreign policy. So basically, the objective here is to attempt and to give a preliminary conceptions about the Philippine environmental foreign policy in the 21st century. So for my outline is the following. For my introductions, I'm going to discuss the necessity of understanding or examining the environmental foreign policy, to be followed by the discussions of the environmental issues in the context of international relations, to be followed by discussions of a short overview regarding how different states from the global north and global south perform and use its environmental foreign policy in the context of global environmental politics, to be followed by my case study and case studies, and second to the last is attempt to conceptualize the 21st Philippine environmental foreign policy with a short conclusion. So for my argument is this. This paper argues that the Philippine environmental foreign policy is based on state-centric approach with the concern of relative gains on whether it will cooperate or not in an environmental agreement. State identity and international reputations are within the concern of Philippine environmental foreign policy leading to support in addressing environmental issues. So for my introductions, as we all know, the Philippines is one of the vulnerable country to climate change and weather events. We witnessed different super typhoons that devastated and causes lives and also contribute to the economic loss of the Philippine economy. And as we all know, in the literature, it will said that developing country has no priority in discussing or dealing the environmental issues, given the fact that we are currently facing different socio-economic and political issues that we need to urgently discuss or to be solved first. But on the other hand, there's also a potential, and there's kind of potential for the developing country to use its position to influence the negotiations between the global north and the global south, given this kind of idea of power to destroy. Developing country is not our country is not responsible for causing most of the environmental damage, but at the same time, these are the countries who possess rich natural resources. So in that way, they can use that natural resources as a leverage in a kind of influencing what will be the position of global north in the context of the ideas of power to destroy. So later, I'm going to discuss how the Philippines use that kind of positions, or is the Philippines using that kind of positions to at least influence the negotiations between the global north and global south. So understanding environmental foreign policy also may reveal important national or organizational characteristics shaping state environmental behavior both domestically and internationally, given the fact that we need so much ideas, understanding, examinations of the environmental foreign policy because of the urgency to address the environmental issues that from 3 years from now we can totally witness the effect of climate change. So my case studies are the following: the Philippine-Germany bilateral relations as an agreement on transboundary haze pollution and Paris Agreement. So basically this agreement, bilateral, regional, and international, discuss and address the issues of carbon emissions from the context of regional and international. So for my a short background regarding to the concept of environmental foreign policy, Bardul argued that there's no group of scholars have articulated even the school of realist, liberal, or even Marxist theory on environmental foreign policy in specific terms. So the tendency here, also the international relations theory failed to account what will be the effect of environmental issues in the international relations. So later, we'll find out how this kind of environmental issues dictate and shape the possible or the future international relations. So environmental foreign policy, as defined by Harris, one of the leading scholars in global environmental politics, discuss this will be conceived as an interplay between domestic and international political forces, institutions, and actors dealing with the human-environment relationship. So basically, this is a kind of external policy of a specific state addressing the environmental issues. So this concern of environmental issues can be addressed through cooperations options such as unilateralism, bilateralism, regionalism, and multilateralism. So for Bartol, as continuations, the climate change environmental issues could change state systems and international relations. So from those scenarios, state can have rational and self-interested policies aligned with other state collective interests in mitigating environmental issues. So how do we find the environmental issue in the context of global north and global south in the global environmental politics? So for this kind of situations, as we all know, this is a product of colonizations, imperialism of the global north to the global south. They try to exert and exploit the natural sources of developing countries and cultivate and develop it in their own homeland, which is they have the kind of industry, so that in that kind of situations, global north is one or the most contributor to the emissions, carbon emissions. So this raises the ideas of common problems, different responsibilities. As we all know, the developing countries, these are the countries who has rich in natural sources, but the tendency lack of industry to develop. On the other hand, the north are those countries that have this kind of mechanism and industry to develop raw resources. And in that way, they are expected to contribute more when it comes to emissions. And at the same time, Global North is expected to adjust to industry and economy and expected to provide financial and technical support to the Global South. So how do we find this kind of state in the context of different countries from the Global North and Global South? For the context of developing countries, we have the Argentina, Mexico, and Venezuela. There are more, these cases as discussed below is the kind of environmental foreign policy creations or formations is rely and heavily dependent on individual. But at the same time, those environmental foreign policy was used to respond to the hegemon positions. For example, in the case of Argentina, they used or to ratify in the Kyoto Protocol to appease the United States. While on the other hand, Venezuela, as a case during the early 2000, they used this kind of positions to ratify for to improve the relations with other hegemon and to counter the United States. For India and China, as a developing country, rising developing countries, they adopt ambitious climate change to use the potentials of our asset and taking responsibility. For South Africa, as another developing countries, use it as the environmental foreign policy was influenced by government, official, scientific, but however, these are merely symbolic and opportunistic actions. On the other hand, if we're going to compare the Global North, they are institutionalized. They used to include different non-state actors in the foreign policy formations about the environmental issues. For example, for the case of European Union, they use it in the different context. For example, if you're going to establish diplomatic relations, they include the environmental issues in that clause. So, how do we find what are the findings about the case of the Philippines when it comes to its in developing status and how it responds to develop countries when it comes to different bilateral, regional, and international agreement. So for the case here, the bilateral agreement, I use the context of Philippines, Germany. So Germany is one of the important actors in the European Union when it comes to environmental foreign policy. So for the case here, the bilateral talks about the ideas of having this kind of Germany subsidizing or supporting the Philippine context in when it comes to technical assistance for the preparations of national red and mechanism for greenhouse gas reductions and conservations of biodiversity in the Philippines. So this kind of relations, the key actors are the following: the German Federal Ministry for Environment and the DNR. The background here is the Philippines wanted to comply or at least meet the new challenges of climate change. However, there's no coherent strategies and incentives to tackle deforestation the Philippines at present. So in that way, this kind of recognitions for the Philippines as developing countries, the developed world or the developed state has this kind of expertise and capability to provide technical, financial, and expertise assistance to the country. Especially this kind of relations between Germany and Philippines help the Philippines to come up with the kind of ideas and advocacy to that will be used in the succeeding years, especially the presence of the Philippines in the Climate Vulnerable Forum or in the Paris Agreement. So in the context of regional agreement, so we have here the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution. So this agreement is the first regional proposal in the world to mitigate and prevent haze pollution through concentrated nationwide efforts and intensified regional and border cooperation. So the key actors here are the following: the executive from the DFA, DNR, DILG, ASEAN, even the president itself. So the legislative, most likely the initiative to tackle and to ratify to this kind of agreement came from the legislative led by Miriam Defensor Santiago. This kind of commitment or ratification is kind of reaffirming its commitment to address air pollutions in the Southeast Asia. So, but in the context of how the Philippines responds to the developed and developing relations is the issues of transboundary haze pollutions was caused by the industry linked to Singapore and Malaysia. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the place of Indonesia. So in that way, the evidence shows no condemnations from the Philippines. So maybe there's a kind of regional norms that prevent each other countries or state to intervene is a mere factor in this kind of response. So on the other hand, the international agreement, we have the Paris Agreement that established the commitments of all parties to prepare, communicate, and maintain a nationally determined contributions and pursue domestic measures to achieve them. So key actors here are the executive, the president, cabinet members, legislative led by Senator Lauren Legarda. So the background here before the ratifications or the signing for the accession to the Philippines, at least during 2016 time of Duterte is kind of hesitant in assigning this kind of agreements, given that there's kind of recognitions that this kind of context limit the potentially limit the rights of the Philippines to develop its industry. So at the same time, during 2011, it is Philippines become a member of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It is a kind of international cooperations between South to South that discuss and tackle the issues of vulnerability of the developing country. So it is one of the main platform that used by the Philippines to really advance its interests. So really advance its interest towards the global North and global South relations towards the environmental agreements. So during 2015-2016, as under the presidency of the Philippines conducted successful advocacy for the inclusion of the 1.5 decree in the Paris Agreement. This also, this kind of positions was also held by the bilateral relations between Philippines and Germany also helped in having this kind of positions for the Philippine case. So for how do we conceptualize or this kind of attempt? This is kind of working conceptions about the Philippine environmental foreign policy in the 21st century. So how do you conceptualize the Philippines as a developing country? So basically, I'm not going to discuss in detail much. I'm much open to discuss in the open forum. So Philippine participation in 3 environmental agreements discussed above can confirm the state-centric approach with executive legislative relations. In some sort, the Philippine president has some reservations and resistance to initiate the ratifications. Philippine national interests had prominent roles in participations in these 3 agreements, and it shows the national interests have 2 roles here. First, the absence of national interest, and the second, threat against the national interest. So if there's no urgency for the national state to address the issues, the Philippines will not participate at all. So when it comes to when the agreement threats against the objective of national interest, it kind of participate actively. So the state identity and international reputations are within the concern of Philippine environmental foreign policy, leading to support in addressing environmental issues. So from the 2 agreements, we witnessed the kind of reasons behind to signing and ratifications the agreements for the reasons of they want to reaffirm or at least to claim an international reputations that the Philippines is a state that committed to address environmental issues. On the other hand, also resort to engaging international environmental cooperations to minimize the expenses of dealing with these issues. So how Philippine environmental foreign policy responds to the developing relations. So first, there's an inconsistency given the foreign policy are primarily determined by the personalized authority of the president as the head of state. Philippine environmental foreign policy towards the developed countries may behave differently depending on the level of agreement. In bilateral relations, Philippine environmental foreign policy is more receptive and might achieve more when it comes to financial and technical expertise. In regional, its actions may limit by regional norms, while taking a progressive stance in international agreements. Like, for example, in the case of Paris Agreement. So for my conclusions, as I mentioned before, this still recognize the issues that there's a difficulty to come out with the absolute abstract of the environmental foreign policy, given the fact there's a different approaches that can give a different hypothesis regarding the Philippine environmental foreign policy. So this paper recognized the challenges of producing complete abstract of environmental foreign policy, given that there's a different approach. Hence, it encourages researchers to further examine the role of the state and the roles of NGOs, technocrats, business and industry, indigenous people, and elite in crafting the 21st Philippine environmental foreign policy. So I'm looking for for my presentation. I'm looking for your comments, suggestions, and recommendations on how to improve this working paper. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kobe, Bryan. Now we proceed to our excuse me, to our last presentation for this panel. May we call on the presentation of Miss Maria Sjenica Sevilla from the De La Salle University International Studies Department. She will be presenting her paper on Bhutan's climate governance in tourism in the Paris Agreement framework. Miss Sjenica, take it away.
Good day, everyone. I will be presenting a paper titled Bhutan's Climate Governance in Tourism in the Paris Agreement Framework. Bhutan is a tiny non-industrialized kingdom in South Asia. It's nestled among the rugged and fragile eastern Himalayan terrain. It has been identified as highly at risk from the effects of climate change, and this is exacerbated by its low adaptation capacity. Bhutan's communal relationship with nature allows it to offer a captivating sight to visitors while promoting tourism as a vital growth sector and a means to diversify the rural economy. The country boasts of pristine natural landscapes such as glaciers, lakes, forests, and mountains. Bhutan's tourism is rooted in the gross national happiness or GNH philosophy. It is an alternative development model anchored on the Buddhist philosophy that measures a country's quality in a more holistic approach than its gross domestic product. And it also believes that the beneficial development of human society is manifested in the juxtaposition of the material and spiritual development of its people. The high value, low impact tourism approach visualizes Bhutan as a green, sustainable, inclusive, and high value tourism that can contribute to the country's socio-economic development. The GNH principle, as applied to tourism, is considered the principal yardstick for measuring progress. Tourism destinations are already affected by climate change, so the tourism sector has shown a heightened interest in developing adaptation and mitigation responses. Tourism is a climate sensitive sector, and Bhutan's vulnerability increases the risks to hydropower dams constructed along many river systems, which is Bhutan's energy source. Consequently, clean flow generation might be unable to meet domestic energy demand, and the demand for water in Bhutan increased in the last decade due to economic advancements through tourism. Increasing temperatures combined with higher precipitation results in flooding, landslide, invasive plant species, shifting tree lines, and damage to infrastructure. Now, the Paris Agreement is a 32-page treaty that aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to accelerate the time frame for a decarbonized global economy. This agreement and tourism require more attention to business and destination adaptation and mitigation schemes. And in its framework, it recognizes the specific needs and special situations of least developed countries with funding and technology development and transfer. So the problem statement of this research is that the GNH model does not have explicit indicators about energy and climate change, which indicates a disconnect from the Paris Agreement. However, Bhutan's power is in integrating its holistic paradigm with economic growth and climate policy. For the methodology, the researcher relied on secondary data, and these data were analyzed through thematic analysis. For the secondary data, technical reports of international organizations such as the Tourism Council of Bhutan, Gross National Happiness Commission, Asian Development Bank, United Nations Development Bank, and the World Bank were utilized. Peer-reviewed academic journals discussing the interrelationship between tourism and climate change and the implications of the Paris Agreement on tourism, And lastly, online articles about Bhutan's approach to carbon neutrality. The Gross National Happiness Commission defines adaptation as the adjustment to cope with the adverse impacts of climate change. And we have here the four areas of vulnerability in Bhutan's tourism. One, we have daily weather condition limiting air access. Number two, vulnerable infrastructure. Number three, increased health risks from vector borne diseases affecting the number of tourists. And number four, natural and cultural heritage. The first one, daily weather condition limiting air access. The Asian Development Bank reported that the extreme weather conditions make the target of achieving economies of scale in service delivery challenging. This is made worse by the insufficient accessibility that have constrained Bhutan's socio-economic development. The Para International Airport, or PIA, until quite recently, the only operating airport with international ingress, is located in Thimphu in the western region. So the lack of domestic air connectivity means that other regions have limited access to global and regional markets. So to redress this imbalance, the government from one airport in Thimphu created three additional domestic airports, one in Yonfula in the eastern region, another one would be in Bumtang in the central region, and the third one is in Gelefu or in the southern region. So ADB provided initial capacity development technical assistance, and it also upgraded the Department of Civil Aviation's technical capacity. This is aimed at strengthening regulatory and operational performance by enhancing institutional, legal, and regulatory frameworks. The second one is vulnerable infrastructure. This is affecting essential infrastructure such as hydropower systems, industrial estates, human settlements, and even historical and cultural monuments. These infrastructure protect the pillars of economic development in Bhutan, as well as its hydropower exports, national road communications, and cultural heritage, which is earning foreign exchange income through international tourism. This is the result of what we call glacial lake outburst floods or GLOFs. Okay, so in addition to creating these measures to protect Bhutan from becoming vulnerable, the government provided road and communication center to every giwog. And one significant project would be advancing climate resilience of water sector in Bhutan, or the ACREWAS. This forms a core part of the national plan to secure the management of targeted catchment watersheds to protect and restore their capacity to provide sustainable ecosystem services. The third one is increased health risks from VBDs affecting the number of tourists. The World Health Organization defines VBDs, or vector-borne diseases, as human illnesses caused by parasites, viruses, and bacteria that are transmitted by vectors or living organisms that can transmit infectious pathogens between humans or from animals to humans. Vector species require warmer temperature to propagate and transmit infections. Clients of several travel agencies have been advised to carry a mosquito repellent and even consider a dengue or malaria vaccination while visiting Bhutan. So, as part of the government's measure to reduce or curb these cases of malaria and dengue, they prepared a response plan to prevent and control dengue. And Bhutan is also included in the Piloting Climate Adaptation to Protect Public Health initiative, which was developed by the World Health Organization and the UNDP with the Global Environment Facility. Part of the Bhutanese initiative here includes climate data organizing with epidemiological assessments for the country's climate-sensitive diseases. The fourth one would be national and cultural heritage. And one prominent project for this area of vulnerability would be the Bhutan for Life. So, the Bhutan for Life is a cross cutting project with adaptation and mitigation goals. The goal is to manage and maintain the country's biodiversity, cultivate healthy ecosystems, protect Bhutan's forest cover, support communities residing in protected areas, and to strengthen the enforcement and management of protected areas. The Bhutan for Life project employs an innovative financial model that's built around the creation of a sinking fund. This is to support improved management of the country's protected areas while providing the time and resources to allow the government to identify and secure long term revenues adequate enough to maintain these management improvements. And this project also encourages local communities to manage natural resources sustainably. The next part would be mitigation. The Gross National Happiness Commission defines mitigation as the reduction in the anthropogenic emission of greenhouse gases to reduce global warming. Under the mitigation response in tourism, we have Bhutan for Life, it was mentioned earlier, and then we have the Bhutan Trust Fund for Environmental Conservation. The first is Bhutan for Life. So, as discussed under the Natural and Cultural Heritage subheading, the Bhutan for Life is a cross cutting project that includes both adaptation and mitigation goals. A major focus of this multi pronged project is to mitigate emissions by maintaining and increasing forest cover of the protected areas to keep Bhutan not only carbon neutral but carbon negative. So the financing will be used to promote renewable energy generation using biogas and household solar to eliminate the need for local people to use firewood. The second one is not a project, it's a trust fund. It's called Bhutan Trust Fund for Environmental Conservation. This is the world's first environmental trust fund that was established in 1992 between the government of Bhutan, UNDP, and the World Wildlife Fund. So, an endowment of 20 million US dollars was set up as an innovative mechanism to finance conservation programs in Bhutan for the long term. In 1996, it was legally incorporated in Bhutan under Royal Charter, and the funds focus on environmental conservation. It also finances renewable energy. So today, it is an effective conservation grant making organization that is already independent of the Bhutanese government, and it works in partnership with the Bhutan for Life project. So this project is directed to promote the socio-economic welfare of the people through funding projects that focus on environmental conservation, and it formulates its plans and strategy in conformity with Bhutan's environmental conservation priorities and its strategic plan. For the conclusions, tourism is largely government controlled in Bhutan, and yet Bhutan does not have the financial and technological resources. Thus, it has sought the assistance of international organizations and finance institutions to be able to execute its climate adaptation and mitigation projects. Now, tourism and climate related adaptation and mitigation initiatives in Bhutan show components, particularly socioeconomic development and environmental conservation components that are aligned with the gross national happiness philosophy. And on the other hand, the projects are aligned with the Paris Agreement's framework on financial assistance and technological cooperation. As part of the recommendation, the researcher would like to emphasize that this paper is a research in progress. And the researcher also recommends that the next researcher might want to conduct interviews with key government agencies, the private sector, and rural communities involved in the tourism business in order to verify if the GNH model's lack of explicit indicators about climate change resulting in disconnect with the Paris Agreement presents a problem in practical terms. Thank you very much.
All right. All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Sjenica from the De La Salle International Studies Department. All right. So we have heard the presentations of our three panel members, and it's really an interesting discussion on policy and governance, and in particular, it zeroed in on environmental policies. The first presentation focuses on the norm cycle, the norm institutionalization of the Paris Climate Accord and how it affects the Philippine national or the Philippine government's policy towards the environment. No, and then this is something that is supplemented by the second presentation, wherein we saw a survey of policies or foreign environmental policies of the Philippines. And one thing that we can see here is the maintenance of a state-centric approach towards foreign policy, no, albeit environmental foreign policy. We saw that the formulation, the implementation, and even the design of Philippine foreign policy is really state-centric. And we saw in the third presentation an example, no, an example and an innovation on the case of Bhutan, in particular in their environmental policy towards tourism. Okay, so we now open the floor for question and answers. No, we open the floor to our audiences and participants to ask their questions and inquiries to the three panel presentations. So if you have a question, you may raise your hand so that you can be properly acknowledged. And then kindly please state your name. Kindly please state your name and your affiliation. And if your internet capability would allow you to do so, kindly please open your cameras so that we can properly recognize you. Okay, so are there any questions? You can also put it in the chat box if you wish so. Okay. Are there any current questions that we have now? The floor is now open for questions and inquiries on the three panel presentations that we have this morning. All right. I see that we have a lot of participants from the De La Salle University. I see that we have also people from other institutions. So are there any questions that we can begin with? Okay. All right. So I think while there is while we are still warming up, I have some questions of my own. To jumpstart our forum, I think I'll start to ask I'll begin to ask some questions to our panelists because I took down some notes, and this goes. I mean, I have three questions, of course, each individually for the presentations. No, so for the first presentation in the presentation of the group of Miss Hannah Nicole, I just wanted to ask if how aware, no, how aware were civil society groups, how aware were people from the grassroots, no, from the grassroots organizations, particularly from the agriculture sector, aware of this international treaties, no, particularly the Paris the Paris Climate Accord, no? How aware are they of these international exchanges, and how do they actually interpret, if they're aware, how do they actually interpret this? Because in your presentation we saw how the government applies or is being influenced by this norm, no, but on an individual level, how do the civil societies, no, interpret this norm, and are they and how aware are they of this norms, no, these treaties, no? And then for the second presentation by Mr. Kobe Bryan, I was also curious, no, I was also curious on how the Philippine government, no, how the Philippine government actually acts upon this foreign policy, this environment foreign policies, and how robust are civil societies as well, no? How robust are civil societies in lobbying the national government in actually observing and implementing this foreign policies in terms of environmental foreign policies. And then for the third presentation, for Ms. Sjenica's presentation on Bhutan's tourism or the application of the Paris Climate Accord on Bhutan's tourism sector, no, I just wanna ask and clarify as well if how the Paris Climate Accord improved, no, the tourism sector of Bhutan, and if there are certain or if there are instances wherein they actually recognize, no, that the improvement or the changes in their tourism sector is actually a product, no, of the observance or the influence of this treaty. All right, so maybe the presenters can answer the question. The floor is yours. Whoever wants to come first, they may raise their hands or they may speak up already so that we can have now our question and answer.
Hi, good morning, everybody. This is from the first presenter. All right. So just to answer the question, based on our research, I think this is also reflected on our review of related literature that a lot of civil society organizations actually express their disapproval to the first draft of the NDC of the Philippines, and the Climate Change Commission is very much aware of this. So we can definitely conclude that civil society organizations are very aware of the Paris Climate Agreement. However, when you ask how is the Paris Climate Agreement in terms of the understanding of individuals, or when you see it in the point of view of the LGUs, it is not very much translated, because one problem that we saw is that it is not very much disseminated to a lot of LGUs, a lot of some of the even government agencies as well, because it really varies the priorities, especially when the administrations are changing. It's really difficult for everybody to align their plans, to align their goals. That's why we really recommend to start the LCCAP, or the Local Climate Change Action Plan, just so everybody can be more aware of it, as well as our LGUs. So yeah, I would just like to point out that yeah, the CSOs are very aware of it. However, a lot of people, especially on the um, national government aren't yet. So if anybody in my group, my colleagues can add to this. So yeah. Hannah, Julianne, would you like to add anything?
Okay, Hannah and Julianne, do you want to add? Do you want to add further on what Miss Ozara mentioned? No, and it's really quite interesting to know, no, that civil society groups are aware of this kind of treaties, no. And since you focus on the norm cycle, norm institutionalization, and it really interests me on how norms, no, or how treaties, the norm that these treaties create, how they influence not only the state level but as well as the individual level. So that's why I further ask on the civil societies, no, on how they observe this, because we're talking about norms, so we're talking about the social construction of norms, and how they basically can affect not only on a state level but as well as on an individual level. Okay. Uh, All right. I think if your group mates would I think they here? Would they want to ask or would they want to add anything further?
Yes,
Right.
I'm from
Yeah.
Ozara's group. I would just like to add also in connection to what Ara said, is that okay? Just to give context, the NDCs are reflected on the National Climate Change Action Plan of the Philippines, and when we were interviewing this different representatives of CSOs, we actually noticed that most of them are not quite aware of the end cap. So it just shows on the presence of the Paris Climate Agreement here in the Philippines or in the grassroots level, but in the policy level, they have a lot to say about it, and yeah. But when it comes to the individual level, the presence is not very much felt. The Paris Agreement's presence not very much felt. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So let's proceed. Kobe Bryan. You're still on mute.
Good morning and thank you for the questions. So please bear with me. I'm not feeling well right now. So the questions refers to how at least the civil society is participate in the environmental foreign policy formation of the Philippines. I think based on my survey in the literature, I found no literature studying the context of civil society and its involvement. I think this is also a kind of reflections on how Southeast Asian regime tried to exclude the civil society in its foreign policy formation. So however, there is a kind of responsibility for the civil society, at least for the adaptations of different global norms. There is a published article by Sign and Campbell last 2020 saying that how global norms domesticated in the context of the Philippines, and they try to understand the context on how domestic coalitions is really important in the context of domesticating global norms, in the context of at least in the global mining industry. In the mining industry, they situated that there's changes in the international norms on how they address in the mining industry. But in the context of the Philippines, from the start of Arroyo, Aquino, and Duterte, they found out that Aquino administration is the only administrations that try to include the civil society in its foreign policy and even domestic environmental policy in regards to mining industry. I think maybe it's kind of reflections of how the Philippines as a Philippines the structure of the Philippines to try to be more exclusive when it comes to foreign policy that concentrated only on the state actors.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think that affirms, no, or that supplements what the first presentation actually also concluded, that civil society groups have very little or very minute participation in terms of this environmental foreign policy, no, and it's also quite interesting to see that it really confirms or it really shows us a picture of how Philippine foreign policy, you know, when we talk about Philippine foreign policy, it really talks about the certain elitism that lies in the formulation, in the not only in the formulation but as well as in the implementation of foreign policy, no, and in the example, in your example, Kobe Bryan, no, in terms of environmental foreign policy, no, and which is something I think that is not only dominant in the Philippines, but I think most of the literature would also suggest that foreign policy in itself is somehow elitist, and in a way, public opinion has very little, has very little factor in terms of the formulation. And well, unless I think it's election period and the issue that is concerning in the election is something that's really related and close, that is really felt by the voting population, no? Okay, so yes, Kobe, you want to add further?
I just want to add or to extend the discussions about my survey of literature regarding how Global North and Global South implement or at least come out with that kind of positions. At least if you're going to survey the developing countries, for example, the case of Latin America, you will see that there's a kind of exclusions of the civil society. But other cases also you can find out that there are also inclusions of the civil society in its environmental foreign policy. But I think it is a mentionable and mentionable the case of developed countries or the global north, especially the European Unions and the Germany. They try also to include the NGO, civil society, even the scientific community and the scientists and even the public opinion in their kind of positions. So if you're going to compare developing more concentrated in the context of they more rely on the individual, especially the presidential positions and background when it comes to formulating the foreign policy regarding environmental issues, while the developed country is more rely on institutions. They try to institutionalize and establish, they try to include as much as possible the scientific community. And even if you are going to appoint legislators or the parliamentaries, they're ensuring that those parliamentarians are really expert in the field of environmental issues. I think it's still a problem on how do we adopt that kind of framework.
Okay. Now I have another point on that, but I'll reserve that for later, no? And let's have Sjenica now to answer the question a while ago. Sjenica, hi. I think you're on mute, Sjenica.
Okay, there. So sorry for the technical difficulty. Good morning, Sir Francis, and good morning to everyone who's here today. So to answer your two questions, the first one I wrote it down is how the Paris Agreement improved the tourism sector of Bhutan. So I think first and foremost, the Paris Agreement has served to become both a platform and a mechanism to further global cooperation on combating the adverse effects of climate change. So I think this cooperation is definitely much more successful as all the available literature would tell us. It's far more successful than previous climate agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol because the Paris Agreement was able to gather nearly all the signatures of the countries around the world, including Bhutan. And aside from the fact that it furthers global cooperation on addressing the adverse effects of climate change, within its framework, it has included, of course, the financing or the access to green finance. And then aside from the finance, it's also included in the PA's framework that there must be technological development and technological sharing, especially from developed countries to developing countries. So in the case of Bhutan, these components within the Paris Agreement's framework were clearly manifested. And then aside from financing and technological cooperation and development, there is also this one important aspect, which is capacity building. And as far as 2015, that was the beginning of the Paris Agreement taking into effect. From 2015 up to the present, capacity building has also been clearly manifested in Bhutan, specifically in the tourism sector, brought about by the assistance of developed countries as well as international organizations and international NGOs. And earlier, I think I mentioned in the recorded presentation the trust fund, Bhutan Trust Fund. So in these trust funds, help is not just coming from these international organizations, but there are also donor countries. In the case of the Bhutan Trust Fund, mostly European countries such as the Netherlands and Germany have significantly contributed to the capacity building of actors involved in Bhutan's tourism sector. Now, for the second question, are there instances where Bhutan recognized the improvement in the tourism sector because of the Paris Agreement? Okay, I think there is not. So to answer this question, countries that are signatories of the Paris Agreement would actually create their nationally declared contribution. So this is the embodiment of their commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the effects of climate change. So to date, there is already a second NDC from Bhutan. I think this was finalized in the latter part of 2020. So the mere fact that Bhutan already has its second NDC intra-pandemic, that is a sign that Bhutan, the government of Bhutan, recognizes how the Paris Agreement develop the tourism sector of the country.
Right. Thank you, Sjenica. That's a very good explanation and clarification. No? And I think what we can see in Bhutan is a case study, not only case study, but also as a model, no, for other developing countries to adopt, no, or to benchmark on. Okay. All right. So yes, Ozara, you want to say something? You're
And
on. Yeah.
all right, there you go. I would just like to add, just like what Ms. Sjenica said, that what's good about the party signed in the historic Paris Agreement in 2015 is that this accord represents a blend between Kyoto's top-down approach and the Copenhagen Agreement's bottom-up approach.
Yeah.
So with this, it creates standard procedural commitments for all countries, but leaves the non-binding NDCs to each country to decide. So this agreement really sets a more transparent structure for monitoring countries' activities as well as for them to also strengthen their NDCs within the 5-year deadline. I think that the challenge here, especially as reflected in our paper, is that the Paris Agreement also has this conditional and non and unconditional programs or requirements that we need to see. So for the agricultural sector in the Philippines, there are a lot of conditional offers, conditional programs that if developing countries would help, that is the only time that we will be able to implement it. So within the case of the Philippines agricultural sector, that is definitely a challenge because without that help, we won't be able to implement the programs under our NDCs. So that's
Nice.
it for me.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Ozara. That clarifies, no? That clarifies the thing that we're discussing. Okay, so we still have a lot of time. So maybe ask again in our participants in our audience. Are there any questions that you would want to raise? You may ask them now, no? Especially now that we're really having this engagement, this very good interaction and discussion on environmental policies. Okay, are there any questions on the floor? Kindly please raise your hand so that you can be properly recognized. Okay, all right. So well, I see people from the La Salle. I see people from Far Eastern University. And I see our friends from other institutions such as from Dr. Dalia Simangan from Hiroshima University. Okay. All right. So okay. So if there are no questions, well, as I've said, I have another points not to ask now because this is a very engageful and very interesting topic that we are discussing right now, and it's really close to us, no? Environmental policy and governance. This is something that is really suited for a discussion on countries such as the Philippines, no? And then I just want to go back to what Bryan has mentioned a while ago, that you know, in developed countries, there's a trend of including civil society groups in the formulation or in the consultations of their environmental policy. Now, comes to mind that in your presentation, you also mentioned that literature agrees that most of the contribution to environmental hazards are actually from these developed countries. So it comes to mind that is it the reason why they include this civil society groups, this subject matter experts in the formulation of their policies. And on the other hand, something that I also have in mind is, if such is the case, that they include these experts, this civil society groups, I mean, how does it affect? How does it affect their contribution, or how do we see it in terms of their contribution, say for example to greenhouse emissions? No, so Kobe, Bryan, do you have something in mind on those points? I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Wait, how do I answer this? I don't have the background on how civil society, or what are the characteristics of civil society, and how they influence the foreign policy formation of the countries. But I think it relies on the regimes of the a specific state or a specific supranational government, for example, the European Union, that tries to more inclusive and respect the human rights and the participation, or the freedom of the participations of the different groups and organizations to really be part of the foreign policy formations. Yeah, I think it still need to my concentration is on the state, not on the civil society. That's why I did not venture on the context of civil society, on how they really contributed to the foreign
Right.
policy formations. It's just only the literature stated without the clear or detailed discussions about how civil society influenced. But I think it's also interesting topics for in the context of the Philippines, especially the situation here is we are the one of vulnerable countries, and at the same time we are at least in the top 10 of incidents of killings of environmental protection, environmental protectors, and at the same time how civil society tried to really influence that kind of situations.
Okay, thank you, Kobe. Okay, again, are there any questions from our participants, from our audiences, before we conclude our panel discussion for this morning? Are there questions or clarifications from our participants? Okay. All right, so I see that there are none. So any words before we depart, before we end the session? Any other words or any other concluding remarks that our presenters would want to say from the group of yeah, Sjenica, yeah.
All right. So thank you again for this opportunity to add something to what I have presented earlier. Now, Bhutan is a place that we can consider a paradigm when it comes to addressing the effects of climate change, due to how much it has exhibited its determination to adapt to the effects of climate change, as well as to lessen its emission. But this is an ongoing battle for Bhutan. It doesn't stop there. Bhutan's problem is not because of any shortcoming on the part of the Paris Agreement, and it's not even a problem within the government itself. The problem is not with the people, but the problem is the fact that their neighboring countries, such as China and India, who are
Yeah, yeah.
notorious polluters, these are the problems. So these small states, least developed countries like Bhutan, no matter how much they try to adapt and to mitigate, if the rest of the world do not have in their mindset and in their agenda to cooperate to address this global environmental crisis, then it would be very difficult to become carbon neutral, much less carbon negative. So we have to look at Bhutan as a model, and at the same time, we have to realize that this is
Yeah.
a crisis that requires global cooperation. So that's it.
I agree. Indeed. Environmental issues are really something that needs cooperation. I mean, this transcends boundaries, no? And okay, Julianne and Miss Ozara, you're raising your hand. Your group, yeah.
Hello, good morning. So um just to add, the for in the local domestic holistic policy discourse, the CCC who implements who developed the NDC and the NCCAP, they lack a regional presence. So it's up to local governments to implement and institutionalize climate justice at the ground level. Furthermore, the issue is that climate justice and the agricultural sector are given varying degrees of attention at the municipal level. So as a result, each region has a different level of development when it comes to developing a climate resilient and adaptive agricultural sector. So the CCC continues to recommend climate change response policies to local governance for their respective LCCAPs, but still these plans of actions are ineffective because the local government units do not invest adequately. The policies are not implemented effectively and are not communicated to the local agricultural communities.
Okay, thank you, Julianne. And then Ozara, very briefly, okay, a few words on because we're already time check na tayo, no? So yeah, Ozara.
Yes, all right. So just to conclude our presentation and our end as well, is that I would just like to reiterate that the unfortunate truth is that agriculture, particularly rice cultivation, has not been a successful endeavor in the Philippines, especially for the small farmers, despite their very crucial role in food security, because rice cultivation farming here in the Philippines seems to be not profitable. So I hope that we all send out our voice and push for this one to improve more of the agricultural sector system and policies that limit the sector's productivity and profitability, especially now that, speaking to the Climate Change Commission weeks ago, they are in the process of revising the National Climate Action Plan of the Philippines. So I hope that through this event, through our paper, we will be able to voice out what is really needed by our small farmers out there. So that is for us. Thank you so much for this opportunity, everybody.
Okay, very good. Okay, congratulations, everyone. We really have a very fruitful and engageful discussion this morning. And to wrap it up, there's a very interesting topic on environmental policies. And this is something that is really close to us. This is something that we can really feel, no? But then, okay, I think Kobe, yeah, Kobe, you wanted to say something? Okay, I think we still have some time. Okay, go ahead. You are muted.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought we are all need to give a closing remarks. So I think it's election time, and based on my conclusions, there are inconsistencies when it comes to creating a foreign policy that pushes the interests, especially of the marginalized and the situation in the Philippines. I think it is important for us to, as academicians, to be heard by these different government institutions and to actively participate in the discussions of how should the government address the environmental policies or environmental issues, and that we need to ensure that the next elected officers or the state leaders are the ones who really care for the interests of the marginalized or even the vulnerable sectors, not by the interests after of the elite and the industry and the corporations. And I think that's all for my closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Kobe. Okay, so yeah, again, congratulations, everyone, and to our participants, thank you for joining us in this discussion. I hope that we can have this kind of discussion again in the coming years or in the next years in a face-to-face setup, no? But I just want to emphasize as well that we might be actually facing the COVID-19 pandemic. But well, aside from this pandemic, I think that we should also look on the issue of environmental crisis, no? Because this is also something that would affect us all. That this is something I think that I mean we all know that this is something that's happened or happening even before COVID started. So as I've said, this is a very good discussion because this is something that we can really feel. This is something that we can really see. And I mean, to point out further, I think this is something that's really something of an existential in nature, that not only on the part of the government, but on our part as individuals, as citizens of this planet. Okay, so have a good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this panel discussion. To our presenters, congratulations. And we look forward to read your researches when they get published. And to our participants, thank you for this discussion. We still have several sessions, policy sessions and roundtable discussions this day for this FISO conference. No? Okay, someone raised his hand. Bryan Dose would want to raise is raising his hand. Yes, Bryan.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much, Francis, for chairing this panel. At 10:30 p.m., we will have our fifth panel about the economic and social impacts of the Anthropocene. For those who are interested, please proceed to room 1 at exactly 10:30 a.m. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's a minute to go, no? 10, actually, it's already 10:30. So without further ado, thank you very much, everyone, and have a good morning. Hopefully see you on the next conference of PISO face-to-face. Okay, have a good morning, everyone, and you may start leaving the room already. Thank you.